Before we get into how the Mongols built the most ruthless physiques on almost no food, let me ask you something you'll almost certainly get wrong. When a Mongol warrior spent 2 full days crossing open steppe with no river in sight, no well, and no wagon behind him carrying water, what did he actually drink? It wasn't rationed water, carefully measured out to make it last. Instead, it was the blood of his own horse. A quick cut into the animal's neck, a mouthful caught and swallowed, and the wound sealed shut with a pinch of hair so the horse barely broke stride. Marco Polo, who traveled among the Mongols and recorded what he saw, wrote that a Mongol horseman could go 10 days' marches without eating any cooked food, surviving on nothing but his horse's blood and milk for the length of an entire campaign. Which should tell you everything about how little a Mongol warrior actually needed in order to keep fighting. And it's exactly why historians still argue about how an army eating almost nothing built the largest contiguous land empire human beings have ever produced. But drinking a horse's blood is one thing. That's not what built the physique. So how did Mongol warriors actually pull this off? How did they ride for days on end, hold a bow drawn tight enough to put an arrow through armor, and still fight like the most feared soldiers on earth, all while eating next to nothing? And it wasn't one trick that explained it. It was an entire system, built piece by piece, with every part depending on the one before it. If you want to know what that system actually was, subscribe and stay until the end. Because the piece that let Mongol warriors stay strong while eating almost nothing is the part most people today get exactly backwards. But before we get into how their bodies pulled this off, we need to understand the scale of what they actually achieved on that diet. In 1206, a man born Temujin united the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe and took the name Genghis Khan. Within about 80 years, his descendants controlled roughly 9 million square miles of Eurasia, more territory than any land empire before or since. After a Khwarezmian governor executed a Mongol trade caravan, the invasion that followed leveled Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur within 2 years. And that alone would be remarkable. But what's harder to explain is how they did it. You see, every one of those campaigns was fought without the one thing every other army of the era depended on: a baggage train of bread and grain following behind. While a European or Chinese army cut off from its wagons starved within a week, a Mongol army barely noticed, because it was never carrying enough food to lose in the first place. That is the detail worth holding on to, because it means the conquest and the diet were not 2 separate stories. The empire was built on soldiers whose bodies could do the one thing no supply line ever could: keep working with almost nothing in them. So now it's clear that Mongol warriors were eating far less than the men they fought. But that alone doesn't explain how riding on so little food built some of the most ruthless bodies in history. To answer that, we first need to know exactly what little they did eat when they ate at all. The answer is dried meat, pounded and hardened until it lasted for months. Dried curds, pressed into something closer to a hard block than a cheese. And airag, a fermented mare's milk that was sour, faintly fizzy, and carried in a leather flask against the saddle. Bread and grain barely featured at all. Their diet was built almost entirely around what their herds produced. And what their herds produced was fat and protein rather than carbohydrate. That single detail is the first real clue to how the physique was built. A body raised for generations on fat and protein instead of bread and grain does not run on the same fuel a modern body does. And that difference is where the ruthlessness actually starts. Most modern bodies run primarily on sugar. You eat a meal, your blood glucose rises quickly, your muscles burn through that fuel fast, and a few hours later you are hunting for the next meal, or your performance begins to slide. It is a fast engine attached to a small fuel tank. A body raised on almost no carbohydrate builds a very different kind of engine. one tuned instead to burn fat, a fuel source the body can store in enormous quantities even when it looks lean. In 2016, researchers studying elite ultramarathon runners found precisely this split in a modern population. Athletes adapted to a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet burned fat at more than double the rate of athletes eating a standard high-carbohydrate diet, and they reached their peak rate of fat burning at a much higher level of effort, around 70% of maximum output compared to 55% in the carbohydrate-fed group. In plain terms, the fat-adapted body could push harder for longer before running out of usable fuel. A Mongol warrior, raised from early childhood on meat and milk with almost nothing else, was essentially that kind of athlete by default. Not for the 6 or 8 weeks of a research study, but across an entire lifetime. Days in the saddle without a proper meal did not drain him the way the same days would drain an opponent raised on bread and beer, because his body had already spent decades learning to run on the fat it carried inside it. That explains how he kept moving without food. It still doesn't explain the blood, and the blood turns out to be solving a second problem the fat alone couldn't touch. Blood is one of the most iron-rich and protein-dense substances a human body can consume. Iron is the raw material the body uses to build hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen to working muscle. And a rider drawing a bow for the 100th time that day, legs locked around a horse moving at speed, needed efficient oxygen delivery more than almost anything else. A few careful mouthfuls of blood, taken rarely enough that the horse suffered no real harm, solved 2 problems at once, providing hydration when there was no water for miles, and supplying the raw material for the very system that kept his muscles supplied with oxygen on the 12th hour of a ride that had started long before dawn. There was no well and no river anywhere nearby, and it did not matter, because the supply line was already moving beneath him. And the same trick keeping the rider alive was quietly happening in the animal carrying him. Mongol horses were themselves remarkable, smaller and shaggier than the war horses bred in Europe, but built for exactly this kind of endurance. Studies of the breed today have found an unusually high proportion of slow-twitch muscle fiber in their legs, along with an enhanced ability to burn fat for fuel, the very same trait researchers were measuring in those ultramarathon runners 800 years later. Rider and horse were, without either of them knowing it, running on the same underlying principle at the same time. So fuel and oxygen explain how a fasted body kept riding and fighting. They don't explain how that body avoided the sickness that gutted every other army living rough on campaign for years at a time. That answer was also riding in the saddlebag. Airag, that sour fermented milk every rider carried, was quietly doing something to Mongol bodies nobody at the time could have explained. Modern research into fermented dairy products like it has found they are dense with live bacterial cultures, including strains of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, which colonize the gut, strengthen its lining, and measurably support immune function. Warriors who camped in filth, drank from whatever water they found, and slept in the open for years needed a digestive system that could take a beating and keep functioning. And airag gave them exactly that, a shelf-stable source of the same probiotic effect doctors now recommend deliberately. It was also mildly alcoholic, enough to work as a rough antiseptic when clean water wasn't available, and light enough to drink steadily through a full day of riding. Put these pieces together, and something becomes obvious. The armies the Mongols defeated were not simply outfought on the battlefield. They were out-engineered at the level of digestion and immune function, by men drinking soured milk out of a saddlebag. Every piece so far explains how a Mongol warrior survived on almost nothing. None of it yet explains how he stayed strong enough to actually fight on it, because burning fat for fuel and drinking blood for oxygen should still leave a body running on empty by the end of a long campaign. The strength came from somewhere else entirely, and it started years before any warrior went hungry on his first real campaign. Mongol children were placed on horseback almost as soon as they could sit upright and handed a small bow not long after. By the time a boy reached fighting age, he had already spent roughly a decade building the exact muscle groups the steppes would later demand of him under pressure. Not inside a gym, but on the back of a moving animal. Every day, through the same wind and cold, his future enemies had never trained in at all. The war itself did not build that body. Childhood did. The war simply asked the body to prove what it could already do. Picture what the job actually demanded of him. A Mongol composite bow needed a draw weight that historians estimate at well over 100 pounds, pulled not while standing still, but from a moving horse at a full gallop, sometimes twisting to fire backward over the saddle at a pursuing enemy, again and again for hours. That kind of repeated effort builds a back, shoulders, and grip. Most modern athletes never develop, simply because they never load those muscles from an unstable, moving platform over and over for a lifetime. Add a full day spent gripping a horse with the thighs and core just to stay upright, and you get a body shaped almost entirely by function, dense through the back and legs, with forearms toughened by the bowstring, yet never carrying excess weight, because excess weight was dead cargo, and dead cargo slowed the horse down. That kind of strength should still have collapsed under a diet with almost no food in it. Building muscle takes raw material, and a warrior burning his own fat reserves for days at a time still needed something to rebuild that grip and that back with. That raw material was never in question, because it was already built into everything he was eating. Meat and blood are both dense in protein. The nutrient muscle is actually rebuilt from. So while the body pulled fat from its own reserves to cover its energy needs, it never had to break down muscle for fuel, because protein kept arriving steadily from the same herd that supplied everything else a warrior needed. Lean, because there was never a surplus to store as fat. Strong, because the muscle was never starved of what it needed to rebuild. Two outcomes people today assume you have to choose between, and the Mongol system produced both at once, because it never treated them as separate problems to begin with. None of these four pieces worked alone, and put together, they finally answer the question this video opened with. The fat-adapted engine meant Mongol warriors did not need food every few hours the way their enemies did. The horse's blood meant they did not need water. The airag meant they did not fall sick the way settled civilizations so often did. And the protein meant none of it cost them the muscle they actually needed to fight. Remove any one piece and the system breaks down, but keep all four running together for a lifetime in every rider, and that is how a body runs a war on almost nothing and still wins it. And that system is exactly what made them so ruthless. It was never really about the size of the horde. It was the fact that the horde never needed to slow down to eat. If you want the complete framework behind building a body that runs on less and performs on more, that's exactly what The Art of Living Like a Man lays out. The link is in the description. The ancient way exists to recover what was lost. If this changed how you think about what a body actually needs in order to perform, you already know what to do.